It is a pleasure to me to introduce Jason. Jason has a lot of energy. He's been spending the last 6 months traveling the globe and has been on just about every continent. And he's been on every continent talking about a sort of a crazy idea that when most people first hear about it, they're just flabbergasted. And it's about maybe trying to, to manage the climate. And so Jason has an affiliation at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. He started his career at the University of Edinburgh, I think, where he had a couple of degrees in physics, his bachelor's and master's. He went on to get his physics degree at the University of Alberta, and from there went to Silicon Valley. And then got wise, wanted to not make tons of money, but he went back to the Kennedy School at Harvard and studied science policy. And he's really getting into some very big and perhaps overwhelming to some of us questions about science, really serious global problems like climate change and sort of doing something about it with science and technology. So some maybe mind-boggling ideas. And I think Jason, as much as anybody, has thought about these very deeply and thought about them with various serious people who are on the forefront of these issues. And I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation. Laurie Young, Christopher Preston, and Wiley Carr and I are working on a National Science Foundation grant working on the ethics of some of these geoengineering proposals, specifically solar radiation management. And that's what Jason here is on those funds. And so thank you for coming, and Jason Blackstock.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be visiting my colleagues who are working on the same sorts of issues that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Now, when Dane asked me to give a public lecture while I was visiting, I suggested to him that I wanted to give a talk that I haven't given before, a talk that tries to pull together a variety of threads of work I've been doing over the last decade, ranging from the sort of scientific research through to technology development, through to public policy, and think about how these knit together. And so when Dane says, I'm trying to tackle some questions that might be overwhelming to you, trust me, I feel more overwhelmed than probably anyone with these questions, because they really do get to some of the fundamental issues of how we're going to shape the future of our global society, and how we as individuals, as communities, nation states, all add up to a global society making these decisions. And that's actually at the core of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I want to premise, the premise for this talk is a question that I've been asking myself, and it's a broad, massive, overwhelming question of the sort that Dane was talking about. How can our global society, again, global society being made up of all the diverse individuals in this room, around the planet, the family groups that we make up, the communities, the nations, how can we make collective decisions about how we're shaping the future of our planet? How often do we even think about these sorts of questions, about the future that we're trying to create? What does it mean? What do our individual and collective actions add up to shape, and how are we making those decisions? So, of course, I am quite confident that I cannot answer this question for you tonight. It is far too big. But what I'm hoping to do is spark a conversation about it. And to spark a conversation about it based off of some of the experiences that I've had, particularly working in climate change. Now, to begin with, I'm going to break it down into two questions that I'm going to try and go through that are slightly smaller but still almost equally massive. First off, the question of, how are we shaping the future of the planet today? It's not going to come as a shock to anyone in this room that humanity has been reshaping the surface of our planet in a whole bunch of different ways. The very fact that we're sitting in a nice indoor, heated environment is demonstration of how we've changed at the local level. But as this is all added up, as the population of the planet has expanded, as we've all tried to increase the quality of lives that we have, the quality of lives we can provide for our children and our futures, these impacts have added up in a lot of unintentional ways to end up shaping the global planet in ways that we never anticipated or imagined 20 years ago. And are now the questions that we're facing as individuals through to a global society are, how do we change and alter the ways in which we're changing the planet? Now, let me start before I dive into climate change, I want to start by introducing the sort of broader scope of ways we're altering the planet. This is a chart that was produced by just a couple of years ago by a leading group of scientists out of the Stockholm Resilience Alliance. And it had scientists involved from all around the world. And they produced this idea called Planetary Boundaries. What they did is, as scientists, they got together and said, all right, what are all the global trends in the way we're changing society now, or changing the planet now because of the actions of society, and how are these adding together in order to threaten societies, the way we grow food, the way we use water resources, the way ecosystems survive. And they came up with 9 areas that they defined as planetary boundaries. What a planetary boundary meant to them was areas where the way in which we're altering the system has the potential to tip the entire planet out of balance enough to have drastic consequences for societies, for ecosystems, for the planet we live on in our future. Now, these range from climate change is the one I'm going to spend most of my time talking about because it's the area I work on most personally. But I wanted to start by putting these questions in the broader context of it's not just climate change we're talking about. Ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is caused similarly by CO2 emissions into the atmosphere being absorbed by the ocean. And when the CO2 dissolves, it makes the ocean slightly more acidic. But slightly more acidic to marine animals can be very devastating. It can destroy reefs. It can destroy shelled animals in ways that completely disrupt the ecosystems that rely on these creatures. And considering that the ocean covers 70% of the planet, and the marine life within there provides a huge fraction of the carbon flow that drives our global carbon cycle that we rely on, that's a pretty important area. Stratospheric ozone depletion. I'm sure you all know about the destruction to the ozone layer, which is now starting to move back in a good direction. Ones that people often don't talk a lot about, the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. These are cycles that we disrupt quite a bit due to our agriculture. We use fertilizers that have nitrogen in them, that have phosphates in them, in order to improve how fast we grow crops, how much crops we can grow. But the result of that is we are changing the flows of these materials within the other ecosystems around them. Global freshwater resources, change in land use, biodiversity loss, the rate at which we're losing species, atmospheric aerosol loading. I'll actually talk about that just a little bit as it relates to climate change. And chemical pollution, as they say up there, not yet quantified. It covers a whole bunch of different areas. Now, what they've identified with the bars that go out, particularly the red ones, are areas where our global impact, the impact that is added up from all our different individual actions, is already crossing dangerous thresholds. It's already crossing into areas that are disrupting the cycle far more than the current scientific community feels is safe, or this group of scientists that got together feels is safe. So with this sort of as a foundation, all of these different areas are areas where we are right now shaping the future of the planet today. Now, what it means for the future of our planet is, in each of these cases, is difficult to predict. The science can tell us a lot about the way in which we're disrupting it, but it can't necessarily predict exactly what that future is going to be. And this is one of the things that I'm going to try and flesh out a little bit in the conversation, particularly about climate change and how we make the decisions under those sorts of uncertainty. The second question that I'm going to spend time on after I go through how we're shaping it in more detail for climate change is, do we have examples of ways to make collective decisions that change or improve how we're shaping the future of our planet? Now, there are some broad examples that we know now, that from historic examples. For example, acid rain was a large problem that here in North America and in Europe back in the 1980s. We came up with a process that worked fairly well in order to deal with acid rain. We also did similarly on ozone depletion. We, as a global society, came up with the Montreal Protocol and reduced it. But there's a bunch of issues where we have not yet addressed it. And again, I'm going to deal more with climate change, where the complexities of the problem have added up to create more challenges in the decision processes that we're trying to implement as a global society, as national societies, as regional societies. Now I'm going to dive in and talk about some examples, particularly from climate change, and I'll walk through a little bit of the science of climate change, the science of these different issues of energy transitions and how we're thinking about energy transitions, of other things besides CO2 that are affecting our atmosphere that we're now just starting to think about how to manage the impacts of, in particular aerosols. I'll give you some more examples of that. And finally, I'll get to the topic that Dane raised a little bit, one that has had me traveling around so much, which is geoengineering, intentional modification of the climate system using large-scale technologies. And I'll go through those three examples to try and talk through how we're modifying it and ways in which we have started to, where different groups have started to come up with ways that we can collectively make different decisions. Again, this is the beginning of an exploration, and I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts and your opinions on how you think some of these processes might work to improve the dialogue, to move us towards better decisions. So let me start off with some of the details about, actually just before I jump into that, I want you to think as I'm going along about this, about another sub-question. So what I'm about to present you on climate change is a whole bunch of science that's explaining how we're altering the climate system today. But the science that I'm about to present has a lot of undertones associated with it that shape the way in which we make decisions. So the subtitle to this talk is Exploring the Evolving Role of Science in Public Decisions. And while I'm going through a fairly scientific presentation of these issues, I want you to have in the back of your mind questions about how does the way that that scientific knowledge is being presented, in this case by me, as an example, how does that shape the way you think about questions like, why is it humanity is changing the planet this way? Why is it that we are continuing to do these sorts of things? It's often not for pernicious reasons. We don't emit CO2 because we want to change the climate. We emit it because there are a lot of good societal benefits to the energy resources that we use, to the ability to improve our lives. But I want you to think about how the presentation of science, about who's doing the presentation of science, how does that affect the way in which we make those decisions? How does it affect the way you think about these problems? And as I get to the later part of the talk, what I'm going to try and unpack a little bit is how does the constraints on who has the necessary knowledge to understand these issues, who has the necessary knowledge to inform decision makers, how does that affect the political structures, the decisions, the social decisions that we end up making? So let me dive in now to the talk about climate change, providing a little bit of the foundations and then going through these technical issues a little bit more. We all are well aware of CO2 altering, the emissions of CO2 are one of the core drivers of climate change, heating up our climate system. Now, our climate system is much more complicated than just CO2, and I start with this to sort of drive home the complexity of the science that is underlying a lot of the conclusions that we're trying to get to. This is a map of global heat flows. On the left-hand side, what you see is the amount of sunlight. Now, this is all measured in watts per square meter, amount of energy from the sun that's coming into the climate system. What you see on the left-hand side is the amount of energy that's coming in from the sun, bits that are reflected away and not absorbed by the climate system, and bits that are finally absorbed by either our atmosphere or our surface. This is the energy that drives essentially all of our climate system. Without it, we would be pretty cold on this planet. On the right-hand side, what you have is the re-radiation of that energy back into space. It re-radiates the energy that mixes up with the clouds. It sometimes ends up reflecting back down in backscattered radiation. And the addition of greenhouse gases, that one small component, CO2, is, in particular CO2, is what's driving climate change by trapping that little bit extra energy into the climate system. Now, where does all of this, where does the CO2 come from? The CO2, we certainly know, comes from a whole range of sources that are driven from human behavior. This just shows a breakdown as of 2004, it's very similar continuously, of where emissions are coming from, greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Now, the reason I show this slide is to drive home the idea that the reasons underlying the decisions that we make to pursue activities that emit CO2, to pursue activities that provide greenhouse gases, are because of their societal benefits. Waste and wastewater treatment, the energy that we use to power everything in this room, my computer, transportation, residential and commercial buildings. In other words, the motivations underlying planetary change are ones that boil down very much to our individual choices, to our individual well-being, to the choices that drive us to improve our lives and improve the quality of our lives. And the real question then is, how do these decisions add up collectively to the global change that we're now experiencing? One of the areas that I work on, and one of the examples I'll talk to you about a little bit, is how we transition the energy system that we have and from the sort of high carbon emitting system into one that can produce these same sorts of global goals in the end, the same sorts of individual goals through to global goals of improving human well-being, while at the same time reducing our impact on the planetary system in this way. Of course, so far, we haven't been very successful at it. This is just a graph of CO2 emissions over the last couple of decades. On the right-hand side, those rainbow-colored bars are the projections of scientists of how much they expected us to emit from the year 2000 on. This is an IPCC projection. And what we actually see is, despite the fact that we have a nice dip there in the recession caused by the global economic slowdown, it very quickly recovered. Now, it very quickly recovered despite the fact that the whole economy hasn't recovered, because people started to make additional choices about the sorts of energy that they were going to use. They started to make decisions to use lower costs, easier accessible energy forms, such as coal, that increase the amount of CO2 per unit of energy that's being emitted. So in other words, for every unit of energy that we want to use to improve our quality of life, more CO2 is being emitted as a result of that. This sort of the complexities of that dip and the recovery start to get to some of the global decisions that we're making, some of the global decisions that are driving the planetary change, the issues of economic growth and well-being, the issues of trade and how we secure energy for our societies, that end up so convoluted with the concept of limiting the dangerous planetary change. And this is what starts to get at the concept of managing a living planet. Underlying the concept of managing a living planet, the idea for managing our living planet actually stems from a course that I had the privilege of developing with one of my mentors at Harvard that we teach to policy students. Precisely because it's part of an international and global affairs concentration that tries to introduce the idea of all of these environmental factors into the types of policy issues that are generally thought about in international affairs, that are generally thought about in global governance. We have centuries of textbooks or essays about the ways we should make decisions, we can make decisions and structure our societies and our politics around social well-being, social issues, war and peace, but environmental issues are so much newer. And the complexities that are introduced precisely because the intertwining, the interconnection between the economics, the societal dimensions, and the underlying substrate of the planet, the underlying environment that we rely upon. The complexities of those decision makings add a new layer onto it. Trying to unpack some of the challenges of that was a goal of one of the conference that I ran back in June of this year. So it was the Equinox Summit. Energy 2030 was the name of it. And the whole goal of this was to think through the processes that underlie, the decisions that underlie why we do or do not develop certain types of energy resources. We brought together a group of young scientists, senior scientists and young entrepreneurs, along with senior advisors from policy and the public sector, to think carefully about the drivers underlying the decisions that we are making about the energy resources that we build. This generated a series of ideas for how we can begin transitioning the conversation away from that dip that we saw during the economic recession, the recovery afterwards, into a dip that focuses us more on reducing our impact on the planetary system. Now, I'll talk more about the process that we used for this in a moment, but the main message that I want to give in terms of the current trends is that these ideas for developing a low-carbon electricity ecosystem are not yet being taken up. We're not yet seeing that development at as rapid a rate as we would like. Now, in terms of thinking about the long-term trends of where this is taking us, scientists have begun asking the question about how much change have we already committed ourselves to. This graph here on committed warming represents one of the latest assessments on how much the climate has already been changed by the emissions that we have made into our climate so far, into our atmosphere so far. Now, this is as of 2005. What Ramanathan and Fang did was sit back and calculate what if human emissions to the climate system completely stopped as of 2005. What would happen if a pandemic wiped us all out, wiped out all of our economic systems? What would this produce as a result? And what they did was calculate all the elements that we have in the atmosphere and look at how quickly they would fall out, how quickly the change would occur in the climate system, and projected into the future an estimated probability of what the temperature would be when the climate finally stabilized. In other words, how much warming are we already committed to? Now, the red line on there, the realized warming, is how much warming we had experienced up to 2005. It was about 0.6 to 0.7 degrees Celsius. And their projection is that as of 2005, we were already committed to more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's the minimum projection that they have on that. Now, with the median projection being above 2 degrees. Now, what does this mean? This is where the interpretation of the science begins to influence the way we think about the decision process. Listed at the top are a series of projections of potential tipping points in the climate system, places where the climate system could become unstable if we cross that threshold, could become dangerous, would be a different sort of planetary boundary. And according to their projection, if you just look at the middle of that distribution, the main peak there, they're projecting that we have already crossed, at least we've got a better than 50% likelihood of having already crossed several of those tipping points with what we have in the climate system today. Now, this isn't just CO2 that's contributed to it. What's contributed to our contributions to the atmospheric change that is driving CO2 includes a whole range of different gases and emissions. The right-hand side is the chart out of IPCC AR4, the latest intergovernmental panel on climate change, its assessment report of how fast climate change is emerging. These constituents in the atmosphere range from the CO2 at the top, which we know well, to methane, halocarbons, nitrous oxide, etc. down the list. Now, this can begin to be quite baffling when we start thinking about the politics of climate change. Most of the UN negotiations focus very exclusively on only the CO2, because the complexity of expanding this issue to all of these other constituents is almost mind-boggling when you start to think about the negotiations. But it is precisely this issue that creates that probability distribution that I just showed, that creates the potential for so much more warming than we've experienced today. Now, why is this? I'm going to focus down on just two constituents of this, two of the things that we put in the atmosphere. The CO2 that we know quite well, and aerosols. So aerosols, in particular sulfate aerosols, are something that we've been emitting into our climate system, into our atmosphere, for the better part of the last century. Sulfur is often found in a lot of fossil fuels like coal and oil, and when you burn it, it goes up in the atmosphere as small particles and then rains out. Now, as it's going up, it creates smog and haze, and this creates respiratory challenges, and when it rains out, it contributes to acid rain. Sulfur dioxide was the main contribution to acid rain. Now, as I mentioned early in the talk, we're already trying to clean up. We are already doing a fairly good job of cleaning up acid rain. And for a whole variety of reasons, we've done a fairly good job of cleaning up the local air pollution and are trying to improve our cleanup of local air pollution caused by sulfate aerosols. Particularly in Asia, where the rate of use of coal and the rate at which the burning of coal and burning fossil fuels is introducing sulfur into the atmosphere, they're now experiencing the same sort of challenges that are leading them to clean it up. Now, what does that mean, though? These sulfur aerosols that we put up into the atmosphere, we're cleaning them up for a very good reason. They cause air pollution, respiratory illness, they cause acid rain, damage to our ecosystems. But on this graph here, this actually shows the fact that it's blue and to the left and negative figures on the right-hand side shows that these aerosols are cooling the climate system off. they're actually offsetting part of the warming that we should have already experienced from CO2. Now, how is it doing this? The science of this is very complicated, and the error bars that you see on here are precisely because clouds are one of the most difficult things for scientists to model in the climate system. And all of these sorts of interactions of these aerosol particles that get emitted into the atmosphere end up changing our climate system. So the effects range from directly scattering sunlight. These little particles, the haze that you see over Los Angeles in 1980s movies, or you see over Mexico City today, is a perfect example of how reflective those particles are. They just like clouds, will reflect sunlight back into space without it being absorbed, cooling the climate system down. They also interact with clouds to mix with them, cause them to be bigger and cause them to be brighter. I'm not going to go through the scientific details of this. Suffice it to say that these are complex interactions that we understand are cooling the climate system, but the big question is how much and what effect will it have? Now, the fact that this is one of the fact that we are cleaning these aerosol particles up and therefore removing this masking is one of the things that led Ramanathan and Fang to think about how much warming we're going to be revealing going into the future. But the fact that this is starting to warm the climate system up is something that does not necessarily penetrate into all of the decisions that we make, all of the ways in which science impact the decisions we make. So just one example that I want to walk through, and we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end, is what we're doing about sulfur today. Seagoing ships going out over the ocean, doing the majority of the shipping of goods that we get from to Walmart or to any of these other large stores that are being imported from China are generally shipped over the oceans. 90% of transport still happens over the oceans. These ships, when they're out over the oceans, burn what's called bunker fuel today. Now, bunker fuel is sort of the dirty sludge that's left once you've refined out a lot of the other petrochemicals that you can turn into gas and you can turn into diesel. And it generally has high sulfur content. And for quite a while, we have allowed these seagoing ships to continue to burn it, because when it rains out over the oceans, rather than raining out over our lakes and over our ecosystems, it doesn't actually the acid rain doesn't contribute that much to the damage of the ocean. However, when these ships come into the port, when they come into cities like Los Angeles, they continue to burn this diesel fuel right now, this bunker fuel that has the high sulfur content, which is contributing to a whole bunch of air pollution and thus respiratory illnesses and premature death. 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, the International Maritime Organization made a decision. So the International Maritime Organization is a perfect example of one of these international organizations that are attempting to help us make these collective global decisions. Now, in this case, the collective global decision was focused around the air pollution issues and trying to save these 35,000 premature deaths annually. By what their decision essentially amounted to reducing the amount of sulfur that they are going to allow in the seagoing diesel, in the ship diesel, from 4.5% down to about 0.1%. So a 10 times reduction in the amount of sulfur that's out there. Of course, this decision is great for the port cities. It's great for saving those lives, and it's a perfect driver of the sorts of decisions that we're making about reducing our impact on certain parts of the environment in order to improve quality of life. Unfortunately, though, because of that cooling impact that I mentioned, because of all of these aerosol effects, the backscattering effects, the cooling effects that we get from this, the impact of this one decision is going to be to increase the amount of warming that we are experiencing on this planet by almost the equivalent of a decade worth of carbon emissions. It's a perfect example of the sorts of complexities in making global decisions and making collective global decisions about the way we're shaping the future of the planet. Quite often, these decisions end up siloed around very particular technical or scientific issues. In this case, it was air pollution. In this case, it was saving these 35,000 lives, a noble, valuable outcome. But the potential impacts of this sort of warming on moving us further down that curve of committed warming, further towards some of the tipping points in the climate system, was not taken into account in this decision process. Now, this has led the concerns about the fact that we're not mitigating, the concerns about the fact that we are making decisions like this for good reasons but with potentially bad outcomes, is what has led some group of scientists to take the question a step further. Now, in this one decision here, there are ways that we could potentially change this policy to have a different impact on the climate system. If our goal is to save those 35,000 lives a year, but we don't want to have that cooling, that warming effect from getting rid of the cooling aerosols, what if we continued to emit these aerosols over the deep ocean, far enough away from the port cities so that they don't come into the cities, so that they don't contribute to the smog, but still provide a cooling out over the deep ocean? What if we even increased the amount of sulfur that we're emitting intentionally out over the ocean in order to cool the climate system down by as much as it's going to be warming up because we're reducing sulfur near the port cities? What if we even took that one step further? What if we increased the amount of sulfur we're emitting out over the deep ocean in order to cool down the climate system to offset global warming, to offset some of the CO2 emissions, the warming from CO2 emissions we've already experienced? This starts to move into a conversation about intentionally managing the climate system, or the title of the talk, Managing a Living Planet. This is one element of all of those different elements that's in the planetary boundaries that people are talking about taking intentional management of. Now, the ability of science to tell us that we can do this, to tell us about the amount of warming or cooling that we might be able to get, about the amount of sulfur emissions that we're emitting and the amount of sulfur we would need to emit in order to achieve particular goals. All of that can be done by science. But what science can't tell us is what is our goal for the way in which we're shaping the future of the climate system. It can't provide us with the answers for whether or not we should emit the sulfur out over the deep ocean. Or, let me give you just another example of the way in which science drives the sort of ideas and technologies that can be developed without necessarily answering the should questions, the underlying questions about how we're going to use this information to make decisions. And that's intentional geoengineering. In 1991, this is a picture of the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. Now, when Mount Pinatubo erupted, it injected the same sort of sulfur particles that I've been talking about, but it injected it rather than into the clouds, rather than into what's called the troposphere, the lower part of the climate system where all of our pollution goes. It injected it into the stratosphere, the part of the climate system above the clouds. Now, at first, that just seems like higher. What difference does that make? Well, it makes a pretty big difference in terms of how long the particles stay up there. When we inject sulfur into the clouds only go a few hundred to maybe a few thousand kilometers before raining out and taking the particles with them. That only lasts a few days. These particles only last, on average, a few days in the climate system when we emit them in the atmospheric system, when we emit them from pollution in the troposphere. But when we put them up in the stratosphere, or when volcanoes have put them up in the stratosphere, they last for much longer. So these two plots here, the top plot shows the date of the eruption in 1991 and just measures the concentration of aerosol particles measured around the stratosphere, around the upper part of our atmosphere over the subsequent couple of years. And what we see is they don't fall out in a couple of days. They lasted up there for a handful of years. Their half-life was about 18 months, so about half of them fell out every 18 months, mostly because it was sedimenting from the stratosphere down into the troposphere. Now, the bottom graph is what caught scientists' eyes. The bottom graph is the global cooling effect we experienced because Mount Pinatubo erupted. In 1992, the planet was half a degree Celsius cooler on average, or about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, because of these aerosols in the stratosphere. Now, going back to these ideas for how might sulfur emissions be used to offset, or might potentially be used to cool down the climate system if we're warming it up with CO2, based on this example, and based on the example of many other volcanoes like this and our tropospheric aerosol pollution, scientists asked, well, how could we do this intentionally? if we really wanted to, could we mimic volcanoes? Well, the idea of a nuclear bomb in a volcano to inject particles didn't really go down very well for some pretty obvious reasons. Controllability might have been one of the factors there. But there are a whole bunch of ways in which scientists and engineers have fought up in order to intentionally inject particles up into the stratosphere. High altitude balloons, tubes up into the sky. My personal favorite is the Howitzer in the bottom right, a naval gun that if you point it straight up in the air will fire a shell to 50 kilometers. You can easily fire material up to the height that you want it to. It's not the most economic way of doing it, but to put it in perspective on how easy it is with the technologies that are now being thought of to shape the future of our climate system. If we were to use 10 of those guns, just 10 of them, firing well under the rate in which they're fired in naval exercises or in naval environments, we would be able to inject enough material into the stratosphere in order to replicate the cooling of Mount Pinatubo or more. In other words, cool the planet by half a degree centigrade to a degree centigrade or more. That's a major impact on the future of our climate system that is now within our technological and scientific grasp. Now, the other thing that's kind of shocking is when you think about the fact that it's only 10 naval guns, or more accurately, what you would actually probably do is not the naval guns. It would be a little bit messy and a little bit loud and not very effective, but using high-altitude aircraft. We have high-altitude aircraft that are available today. All you need is a spray nozzle on the back end in order to inject these particles into the stratosphere in order to intentionally cool the climate system down. And with these sorts of technologies, there are estimates now, engineering studies that have been done, and the beginnings of technology development that have been done that suggest we could do this for less than $1 billion a year. Now put that in perspective of the national debt of the US, or the deficit of the US, or the annual expenditure of most multinational corporations, or Mac or IBM, for example. This suddenly seems like a very small amount of money, particularly when you compare it with all of the sorts of, all the amounts of money that have been talked about for doing the energy transition that I talked about earlier. All of the sorts of monies that are being talked about in terms of potentially adapting to catastrophic climate change. If we start creeping up on that curve towards some of the higher temperatures, what will the tipping points or planet crossing those boundaries do to our societies and ecosystems? This seems like a low price. And it's so low, in fact, that single nations could probably do this from within their own boundaries, could affect a global climate. This is how these ideas start to very quickly wrap back in to the policy and political decisions. Now, there's a lot more complexity to the story than this. If simply injecting sulfur into the stratosphere fixed the climate problem, cooled the climate system down, and offset all the warming from CO2, we probably wouldn't have much of a conversation about climate change going on. Unfortunately, it's not anywhere near that simple. The complexities associated with it are much more pernicious than that. When you that energy balance that I showed you at the beginning, I showed you for a couple of reasons. The first was to indicate the complexity underlying our climate system, but the second was to give you a sense of how we're now altering different parts of the climate system. If you're talking about the greenhouse gases, that's reducing the amount of heat that's escaping into the atmosphere, that's escaping from the atmosphere into space. When you're talking about things like solar radiation management or the sulfur pollution, these sorts of geoengineering technologies, you're talking about reducing the amount of sun that is warming our climate system up to begin with, that is driving the climate system that we're used to. Now, these are going to have different effects. They're going to have different effects on precipitation, on where water flows, on heat patterns, on weather patterns. The long story short is that with geoengineering, you can cool the global climate system down, but you'd be substituting one type of climate change for another. Now, that type of climate change may well be more desirable for some people than the type of climate change we would get just with CO2. The science underlying this is still very uncertain. We don't know what type of climate change we're going to get from CO2. What I showed you was a probability distribution. We could be anywhere on that distribution as of right now, and we don't know because we have only so much evidence about the climate system now, and it will unfold over time. We have good reasons to believe it will go into dangerous areas, but you can't know that for certain until you actually begin going there. If we're at the low end of that probability distribution, we're just under some of the most dangerous issues, some of the most dangerous tipping points. If we're at the high end, 5 or 10 degrees centigrade of climate change for this planet would be catastrophic. And we can't know where we are. At the same time, we can't know exactly what cooling the climate system down with sulfur aerosols are going to do in terms of the winners and the losers, in terms of which societies are going to benefit, which are not. Some information we can certainly predict. For example, the low-lying island states. The island states that right now are looking at 20 to 40, maybe 50 years of existence before sea level rise literally overwhelms them. The combination of sea level rise and severity of storms makes those islands uninhabitable. For them, cooling the climate system down could very clearly be a benefit. But flip that around and ask, so I'm from Canada, for example. In Canada, right now, there's a huge investment going on in the development of trade routes through the Northwest Passage, and Russia's doing the same for the Northeast Passage, a huge investment in developing energy resources that could be located under the Arctic Ocean. Now, for those countries, closing down those sorts of resources go to some of the fundamental issues as to why we're having such a problem reducing carbon emissions to begin with. Because these sorts of resources provide for all of the services that we're used to. So how in this environment do we begin to make the sorts of decisions related to whether or not or how or who should geoengineer the climate, should inject aerosol particles to cool our global climate system down? The reason I started working on geoengineering was precisely because it gets to the heart of the original question that I asked. How do we make decisions as a global society? Climate change and the energy transition that I started with as an example, that's something where each of our decisions on a daily basis on how we use energy, how we drive our cars, contributes to the global change. But there are a whole bunch of complex societal decisions that are interwoven with that add up over time. As we move into short-lived climate forcers and the sulfate emissions, that's something that decisions are being made by more centralized organizations today. Centralized organizations because most of those emissions come from coal. In the case of shipping, it comes from a very heavily regulated, centralized industry. You can actually regulate whether or not what type of fuels are going to go in there. And here, at the far end of the spectrum, this is a sort of decision that, at least in principle, could be made by a very small group of people. It could be made by a small group of there have even been proposals that a single individual, a James Bond villain named Greenfinger, could inject these particles for costs of only $1 billion a year. Richard Branson, Bill Gates, to name a couple, certainly have resources well over that sort of money. Now, when we've got these sorts of tiered decisions, with science providing uncertainty across all of them and can lay the foundations for these decisions, how do we begin making decisions collectively about each of these issues together? The complexity of this is mind-boggling. The complexity of this is one of the reasons why some of our best attempts at UN climate negotiations, some of the best attempts at pushing these issues forward have failed, because it brings in so many interdependent issues at the same time, and the science can only take the issues so far. So what is the role of these sorts of scientific ideas in laying the foundations for the decisions we make about how to manage the future of our planet, how to shape the future of our planet? Again, I don't have a good answer for how we should do that. What I have instead are a handful of examples, some good, some possibly not so good, or things that we can learn from, each of which I've talked about a little bit, but I want to talk about a little bit more as examples of ways in which we're starting to make collective decisions. Examples of processes that we can use in order to come together to generate new ideas for how these decisions should be made. So one example that I mentioned briefly was the Equinox Summit, and I want to talk about this a little bit more, because this focused particularly on energy transitions. It asked questions about how can we begin to develop and introduce technologies into the systems, into our energy system, that will reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting as a global society. Now, quite often what ends up happening in the IPCC assessments reports, in a lot of the scientific studies that go on, is you get a great group of scientists developing technological ideas. Now, these technological ideas, for everything from nuclear power to geothermal power to renewables such as wind and solar, have great scientific foundations. But where they run into some of the largest problems are with whether or not they're taken up and integrated into the societal systems. And that often runs into all the sorts of barriers that I talked about in that little dip in the curve that we saw and the recovery that we saw in the trajectory of global carbon emissions. The choice that countries around the world have made to develop dirtier or more carbon-intensive energy sources because they're cheaper and more available as a result of the recession, that's something that happened precisely because there is not an integration of these sorts of technologies into the decision-making structure. So what did we do? For a conference last June, we brought together a group of leading scientists, each of whom represents one of these technologies, was a world expert in a handful of technologies on the generation, storage, or transport of electrical energy, focusing the problem down in a narrower area than solving all of global climate change. We focused on electricity production. And we mixed those scientific experts with a handful of young entrepreneurial policymakers, businessmen, NGO representatives, and political folk, in order to ask how these technical ideas could be developed and integrated into the technological uptake of them. This ran over a few days, and this ran over 4 days in June, and since then we've had a whole series of meetings that we're continuing to run around the world that identified the missed that slide, sorry. That identified that slide I showed earlier. I'm just going to duck back up to it. This one. That identified a handful of ideas for how each of a suite of technologies could be integrated to places where there is an urgent societal demand. So rather than starting with the scientific ideas, with the technical ideas as the solution, they started with what are the problems that are trying to be addressed? What are the drivers underlying why we're making the decisions and choices we are to move towards dirtier energy? We started with places such as off-grid, places where right now 2 billion people on this planet essentially have no electricity access whatsoever, but are burning biomass, are burning dirty sources of energies, both dirty locally and carbon-intensive in some cases with coal. And asked, how could we introduce technologies that are low carbon, that would introduce electricity, supply the basic demands that are required, the basic standard of living that we're all benefiting from because we have the electricity available on demand. How could we introduce that at the same time as developing flexible, the sort of solar storage units that would enable these environments to deploy these technologies at an early stage? We developed pathways for how business and innovation could integrate with with these challenges and the technology development in order to achieve the goal. Baseload, we addressed large-scale storage, renewable energy, geothermal, advanced nuclear. We went through a handful of these in cycle. Now, the whole idea here was to begin to develop an international network. So the reason we went through this process of bringing this large group together across these different areas and put them through such an intense process over a couple of days and continued to build the network is because we believe that one of the main foundations is an international conversation, is an international dialogue about the ways in which not only these particular technologies can be evolved, but ways in which we can build larger structures around this sort of integrated science, policy, and society conversation, science, policy, and business. Because right now, the silos around each of these have been preventing the evolution of these sorts of technologies. Now, the other decision, second decision that I want to talk about is, or a process for making a decision, is the one that I already talked about underlying the decision about sulfur. The decision of the International Maritime Organization, as I said, was based almost exclusively on the air pollution issues. It wasn't based on climate issues. It wasn't based on an assessment of what the climate impacts would be. Now, why is that? Why was the science that we had available in this case on the climate impacts not integrated to the decision-making process? Well, this goes to the way in which we currently structure our international organizations. The UN has numerous agencies, each of them dedicated to very particular issue areas, from development to the Environment Program to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, each dealing with their issue area. This goes back to the way in which we have often structured our thinking about international political issues writ large, our political issues around security and peace, around weapons management. But the interconnections underlying these different issue areas are starting to make that sort of siloed structure much more difficult to achieve the goals as a collective society we may want to have. We don't have a framework right now for how these international organizations could begin to come together and collaborate across these decisions to create decision structures that would integrate science from the different issue areas together. But it's one of the foundations that I think we're going to have to begin developing. And we do have some models beginning to develop for that. So the last one I'll talk about briefly is related to geoengineering. So this is the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative. I didn't design it, but designed the name for this one. But Andy Parker, a senior policy advisor of the Royal Society, has been the coordinator of this effort led by the Royal Society in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, an NGO that originated out of here in the US, and the Academies of Science of the Developing World, a partnership between these different organizations spanning pretty much, what was it, 2/3 of the globe, and trying to bring together a group of individuals that spanned almost an equal diversity of the institutional the countries represented and the institutions involved. Now, the whole purpose of the SRMGI for short was to bring together these experts in order to ask the questions about, first off, what do we know about the science today? What does the science tell us? But more importantly, for these geoengineering ideas, for these ideas of intentionally taking management of the climate system, what are the governance issues? What are the political issues? What are the issues about the way in which the future could be shaped by a small number of individuals? So the framework for this began with an expert group beginning to ask these questions, beginning to identify the sort of issue areas that needed to be addressed, and then convening a broad global dialogue. This is why I've been in India, in China, in Singapore, etc., traveling along with colleagues from this group in order to start these conversations there, to lay the foundations for more of the global conversation about how we're going to manage these technologies to shape the influence that they're going to have on our planetary future. Now, this has been a very quick whirlwind tour of a handful of issue areas specifically related to climate change that have informed my thinking, that have informed the foundations of how I'm beginning to tackle more holistically the question of how can our global society develop the ability to make collective decisions, and particularly, how can science begin to inform it? Each of these case studies leads to different lessons and different examples, different challenges when you talk about the sort of broad global decision-making that's required for things like energy transitions, the sort of decision-making that's required at the local level through the global level. Just one example on that one of ways in which our science is not necessarily integrated with where those decisions need to happen. The vast majority of the infrastructure that we build, the decisions for that infrastructure are made at the local through state level. But the primary bodies that we have for providing decision advice from the scientific support, in as much as it provides decision advice, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a global body that publishes an assessment once every 5 years. How does that information penetrate down into the local communities that actually need to make decisions about what sort of infrastructure to lay for the future transportation system, what sort of infrastructure to lay or zoning laws to pass about the development of their local community in order to help create a foundation for shaping the future of the planet? Now, that's quite a different structure of decision and a different set of issues that we need to begin to address of how to get scientific knowledge into the hands of decision makers who need to make them on the ground. It's a similar sort, but a different structure of decision being made when you're talking about international organizations like the IMO or even national governments passing large policies about things like sulfur management or sulfur reductions and whether or not they've integrated the science from across these different disciplinary areas, whether they've integrated it into an interconnected decision-making structure that asks the question about what is our goal for the future of our planet. And the final one on geoengineering is one that really begins to force us to think about how concentrated knowledge, how the concentration of scientific knowledge can raise issues about the power of a handful of elites. The scientists that work on geoengineering, that develop these technologies, that introduce these ideas, myself being one of them, have a disproportionate ability to shape the conversation. We have the ability to introduce new ideas, to provide ideas for good or bad. You know, the idea for the atomic bomb wasn't one that I'm sure that, you know, when you read Einstein or some of the other scientists that contributed to the development of the bomb, in hindsight, most of them wished they could have taken it back. But the introduction of those ideas, once they're out there, shapes and frames a decision. And the power of the scientific community, of that small group of people that often have the sort of technological knowledge or scientific capacity, their ability to shape and control the debate is something that we often don't even educate our scientists about. It's something, when I did my PhD in physics, about the closest I came to a political science class was the op-ed page of my local newspaper. Now, when you think about the potential implications of introducing these sorts of technologies, the sorts of disruptive technologies and ideas into our global decision-making structure, and the ability of powerful elites, whether scientific or otherwise, to uptake these ideas. Look at the way nuclear weapons have been uptaken. It raises the sort of questions about how we are going to structure and structure the production of science, structure the questions that we are asking in order to shape them so that we are answering the types of questions we want to answer about the future of the planet we're trying to shape. Underlying all of these are a whole bunch of ethical questions, are a whole bunch of questions about what do we actually want for our future. So I asked you before I gave the more technical parts of this presentation, going over climate change, to think about how my presentation of it influences and shapes your thinking about this, how the individual giving the presentation shapes it. Again, I don't have a lot of good answers to this question on how we could make better collective decisions. There are processes that we can introduce in all sorts of different areas to address each of those three examples, and I work particularly on addressing them in those issue areas. But on all of the different planetary boundaries, on all of the different ways in which our individual and societal actions are adding up to this global change, we have the potential to build better decision-making structures addressing these same sorts of issues. So with that, since I'm running, leave us a little bit of time for question and answer and conversation. Yeah.
So I think that the idea of talking about the problems we face and the resources that are available to us to solve those problems became very clear when you talked about the nuclear bomb, for example.
Yep.
But I can't help but wonder, why would it be that bad if a small island showed up at the next big global meeting? And this is a reference to you said this at your last talk yesterday.
Yeah.
Why not have that big red button sitting on the table and just say, all right, big countries, you guys need to figure out how to slow this thing down, or else we're going to hit the button and the big machine on our island is going to start pumping out sulfur. I mean, I understand why that could be bad, but is it worse? I don't know.
So this, let me just give the example that I gave yesterday during a talk I gave very specifically about geoengineering to put this in context. basically, as I referenced, island states that are starting to disappear, they have an existential threat to their existence. And right now, they have virtually no leverage on the global climate negotiations. They don't emit enough carbon to really matter. They don't have enough trade power to blockade the US or to blockade China or to have any impact. So what leverage do they have? Up until now, virtually none. They've got moral persuasion, but that hasn't worked very well. So one of the ideas that has come out of this sort of work about how these scientific ideas could translate into politics, what if a group of the island states got together and said, you know what, we're going to go to the next climate negotiations with a threat. Either you're going to start reducing your carbon impact on this planet and helping us prepare for climate change better, or we're going to start cooling the planet intentionally. We're going to start managing the planet for our own goals, for our own survival in this case. Now, the question you asked is the perfect question, because it sets up the question, it sets it up in a way that says, well, I have my own opinion about whether or not that's a good or bad thing. There are times when I've considered starting a consulting company that would actually help the island states doing that. There are other times where I've considered, you know, that would be an absolutely horrible thing to do because it's starting a slippery slope, and, you know, the response of the US or China might be, oh, you're going to cool the planet? Well, we don't have to worry about mitigating then, do we? You go ahead and cool it. The outcomes are difficult to predict, precisely because the processes that we use to make these decisions happen at all sorts of different levels, from the individual through democratic societies. It's not about, it's often, when you see charts like the IPCC projections going into the future, when you see the ways in which science describes the future that we're building, it often presents it in a way that hides the fact that it is individual choices or collective choices built from the individual choices that add up to the global decision. The global decision is often an unintended consequence of all of the decisions that add up along the way. And the challenge of thinking through how scientific information is presented and then how it translates into these sorts of into the sorts of decisions we end up taking for granted or making as a result is precisely the question to ask. The question I would flip in return is, rather than is it a good or a bad thing, what sort of conversation would we need to have globally or collectively, whatever that collective means, in order to encourage a better outcome at the end? And then what is that outcome we're trying to encourage? Is it a world with lower carbon emissions? Is it a world with somewhat lower carbon emissions but some amount of solar geoengineering? And what is the choice that's being made between them? There's no easy answers associated with that. But if we're not asking these questions, we're not moving the conversation forward. Please.
In your example of the IMO and sulfur emissions and fuel emissions, so it seems like, you know, to sum that up, if scientists had been present at that regulation meeting, whatever they did, or that the scientist that was there presented that information in a different way, they might have come up with a different way to do things, whether it's good or bad, that on that front end of it, the science to decision-making process, it could have been different. And I sort of, I see, you make a good argument, and I think it's part of the problem that that is a limiting factor. And I just wonder if you expand on some of the other ones. I mean, for example, if science could communicate differently. We live in a country where 50% of the population doesn't believe in evolution. And that's actually how they say it. They don't believe in evolution, which is quizzical. So it's unclear to me that any scientific presentation could get to half the population hate scientists. Or you know, there's lots of other ways to look at it too. There's this sort of heuristical trap of us reinforcing non-action where, you know, I think that scientists and policymakers both in the 90s especially were saying, look, we're going to wreck the planet. You're driving a car, you're ruining things. And it didn't work because every day people woke up and said, hell, it's the same place. Nothing changed, nothing happened. All these, you know, sky is falling people, you know, and nothing's really happened. So there's this kind of, maybe it's just that people don't like to hear bad news, but there's this kind of distrust of scientists coupled with nothing ever happening that people see, you know. And I wonder if there is a way to successfully couch the argument or have science influence policy that will change what you're talking about.
So there are a whole bunch of issues wrapped up in what you just said, and where to begin to unpack it in a couple of short responses. I'm going to pick on one part in particular, and I'm happy to talk about the other parts later. The ability or knowledge of scientists to communicate is one of the biggest challenges that we have had on this issue. As I said, as a physicist, before I went to the Kennedy School and did my training, a Master's of Public Administration, my exposure to policy had been student government, it had been other things on the side, but my average colleague in physics or my average colleague in a lot of my scientific disciplines never touched a political science class, probably not even in their undergraduate. And an understanding that the policy, that the ways in which science is now shaping society far more than it did 50 years ago, and yet we have the same textbooks from 50 years ago. We have the same structure of educational system from 50 years ago. So one response to that doesn't address the whole problem, and this is the whole thing of why this question is not, first off, I don't think I don't have an answer to this, but I also don't think there is a single answer to this. I think this is a constant evolution. Forgive me for using that as a word in that case. In this case, the next step for getting scientists to move better, there are several of them, one of which I work on now. I'm moving over to the UK to develop training programs precisely for early career scientists around how does policymaking work? Where are decisions made? When are decisions made? So the IMO example was a perfect one. The scientists working on these issues, the scientists who work so carefully on understanding the aerosol climate impacts are not the same scientists that work on the health impacts. One studying lungs, the other studying clouds. They often don't even talk to each other because of the siloed disciplines. And so when the decision was being made in the IMO, the scientists who were studying the cloud effects didn't know that the decision was being made. It wasn't in their weekly bulletin. And the policymakers who were making the decision didn't know to ask the scientists because the connections weren't there. Those are the sorts of things where building more integrated, one of the contributions is to this, is beginning to build training programs to help scientists understand policy and political processes and public communication, when and how to inject knowledge, and also understanding that injecting knowledge in and of itself does provide them with, for better or worse, a certain amount of political power. And in decision-making processes, setting the agenda, setting the topic of conversation, or changing the topic of conversation is one of the most powerful tools that you have. And the ability of, for right or wrong, there are a lot of scientists who will argue, we shouldn't be doing any of that. We don't want to know that because it's going to penetrate our science. It's going to poison our ability to just do science and find raw knowledge. And that is likely true, that we want some portion of our scientific community that just is curiosity driven. But as we move forward towards inevitable planetary management, I'd argue right now we're already managing our living planet, we're just not doing it very well. Because we are making these decisions. We are trying to weave these together. But until we get to a stage where we have a better flow of that technical information and have the people capable on both sides, so equivalently training for policymakers of how to understand and when to use that, it's an iterative process. On the issue of people not believing in science, we can talk about that one after, because that's a whole other can of worms. So several questions. So
we know that scientific knowledge and technology has outstripped our ethical and ability to really deal with it wisely. I think that scientists should study humanities. And humanity, the rest of us should study more science too.
So going back to my answer to the last question, I think that's part of it. Understanding, developing a better understanding or an ability to communicate. In some of these cases, it's actually developing people at the interface, people who have the ability to speak both languages. Because if you've ever looked at the curriculum of someone trying to do a PhD in biochemistry, they don't actually have a lot of time to take other classes or do other reading. And so this is one of the challenges with how specialized and intense our knowledge production has become. And it's why when you say it's outstripped our ethics or our ability to manage it, it has certainly outstripped the ways in which we've dealt with them in the past. It's,
We need to slow down.
well, so that's one possibility. Though the challenge with that is, as I pointed in these planetary trends, in the ways that we're going, in some cases, there's arguments that we need to speed up the way in which we understand these in order to reduce some of the impacts.
So this is so top down. We need to start bottom up.
So we can follow up more on exactly what that means and what that looks like, but that's the question about what are the processes. What processes need to be developed, and how do you integrate the science at those different stages? So it's not, gentleman back here.
I have two questions, but the first, I appreciate that this is mainly a geopolitical discussion here, but my first question that I've been wondering about for a long time, and I'm not a chemist, my background was physics and religion, actually, but my question is, who has done research, or is research being funded? It seems to me that a lot of research should be funded on chemical research to try to capture the CO2 in the atmosphere and somehow control it at the start of the problem. You know, this trying to cover it with sulfuric acid or whatever other reactions are going to take place and have unknown consequences seems to me to be kind of worrisome.
So, long story short, there are an increasing number of scientists working on a varieties of carbon capture. So you talked about carbon capture at the source. You talked about capturing carbon before it gets released into the atmosphere. That's one place in which there's been a huge investment of energy in carbon capture and storage technologies. There's also, though, been a whole other side of geoengineering, which rather than trying to manipulate the amount of sunlight that's coming in, has focused instead on thinking about ways to chemically remove carbon from the atmosphere. Now, to put this in perspective, though, the challenges with this. So we do this on space shuttles, we do this on submarines all the time. But in order to, with existing technology, scrub out 1 gigaton of carbon, 1 billion tons of carbon. So that's 1/8 the amount that we currently emit. And actually, it's soon to be even less than that because that graph continues to go up. To take out 1/8 of the problem, today, you would have to build a structure the height, the width, and 5 times the length of the Great Wall of China. Now, that's not impossibly large. We build if you look at the Shanghai or New York skylines, we build things that are that big all the time. Now, the challenge, though, is that it also takes energy. The chemistry that's going to run takes a huge amount of energy to recycle and do it. Where does that energy come from? Does that emit CO2? Do we have renewable energy sources to provide for that? So the short answer is yes. In all of these cases, digging into the different options for how we reduce our planetary impact or how we alter our planetary impact is incredibly important. The question that, again, I sort of turn it back to, though, is because of the complexities in the system, how do we build a process that takes into account the ethical issues, the value judgments that you were raising when you said, it's a much better idea to take the carbon out than it is to stick aerosols in the stratosphere. Underlying that are a series of value judgments or a series of beliefs, and I may personally agree very much with them. But how do we integrate those in the conversation and separate out what we know from the science from the choices we want about what the future should look like? Because there are some parts of the world where, to flip it on its head, for the next 20 to 30 years, take Africa as a perfect example. Africa doesn't emit a whole lot of carbon right now, at least per capita. It's growing in its emissions, but it's going to be a while. But the big question for Africa is, what is the way to minimize the suffering that's going to be caused by climate change, or the suffering that already exists due to AIDS, due to poor governance, due to lack of electricity, due to lack of water, lack of sanitation? And the answer quite often is very intense development will do more for their standard of living and for improving their lives than anything to do with mitigation. So in other words, burning coal is better for them than not, at least in the short run. How do you weigh those comparisons and trade-offs? And again, on the injecting of stratospheric aerosols, in the island state case, even if we could scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere at a fairly fast rate, and even if we started mitigating fast, we took that curve from bending up and bent it sharply down, That curve that I showed about the probability of temperatures for the future means that it's at least a non-negligible possibility, and actually in some cases a probability, that those island states are going to disappear anyway, unless we put something in the atmosphere. So all of these considerations then have to get weighed into some sort of political process, into some sort of decision-making process.
Yeah, first I want to thank you for coming and sharing with us tonight. And you asked us in the very beginning to think about how the way what scientists tell us shapes our thinking. And I just noticed that you use the word complexity about once every 5 minutes during the talk. And that makes me feel like I might not even have the capacity to grasp the implications of the ideas we're discussing tonight. And someone else brought up language as well. And you also talk about, use the phrase penetrating information and injecting knowledge as if it is only a one-way process of learning. So I wanted to just call attention to those. But there was also a bit of a normative component about your beginning of the reasons we make the choices we do, that it's for our well-being and we want to keep that current well-being. And I asked you, circling back to complexity, has there been any dialogue about simplification? Anything about maybe getting less complex as a solution or as a way to make things better?
So simplification, you mean in the policy choices that we make, or in
individual choices as we make as consumers, perhaps?
So so let me start with the reflections in your first bit. Thank you. Those sorts of reflections are precisely the sorts of things that that are important for scientists to hear, that are important to think about and reflect on, because it's entirely true. The communication of knowledge is by no means a one-way street. Setting up a flow of one of the advantages that I've had from working on both sides of science and public policy is I've improved and altered the types of scientific questions that I ask because I now understand better how that knowledge gets uptaken, gets used, gets applied. And it's easy to fall into the sorts of language of injecting knowledge. I did it again tonight. Because it's often the way in which we think about production of knowledge and providing it to someone or giving it to someone. A lecture like this, for example. But the conversation aspect of it and how we set those conversations up, that two-way learning, the sort of knowledge system that integrates these different components, is a critically important question. Now, in terms of simplification versus complexification of issues, that again is sort of a whole other conversation that we could have more offline. There are lots of proposals in both directions. And one of the things that is often so, I'll use it again, complex about understanding this, and it's equally complex for scientists or policymakers or anyone else, is often making small, simple changes have, if you make enough small, simple changes, the net effect of those add up to a very large effect, often unintended, because projecting that is something that science can help with, but it can't always answer it when you don't see, unless you're asking the right questions about it. So that iterative discussion about what those changes add up to. Almost all changes on their surface, like the decision of the IMO, it's a very simple decision on its surface. You should not have 4.5% sulfur in your fuel. You should have 0.1%. That's a very simple decision on its surface. But the implications of it are not always simple. And it's those sorts of, that's what I'm referring to with the complexities and the interdependencies, is the amount every individual's decision now begins to magnify through these systems becomes more complicated.
I have a question about how does paleoclimate affect ideas about geoengineering and policymaking? And I guess when I say paleoclimate, I mean from not just a few million years ago, but like way long.
Wow, that could be an entire lecture on its own as well, and one that I am not a paleoclimatologist, so I can't say that I know the details of all of the paleoclimate data. In short, paleoclimate, particularly going back mostly over a few million years where we have better records, essentially, better data and better information, certainly guides the way in which we think about and shape the climate models that we use. But the vast majority of our policy discussions around climate change, around the impacts and thinking about what the future of the planet's going to look like, come from running climate models that are essentially calibrated to the 20th century. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. We have more data on the 20th century. We have more information about it in terms of localized information that allows us to build global climate models, but also because there's large questions as to stability of the climate system in different sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Different equilibria of the climate system. There are different stable states that our planet has been in at different points in time, and everything from changing radiation coming from the sun through to a very different set of ecosystems and a very different set of biota on this planet now than we had even a few million years ago adds up to a holistically different system. Now, in terms of climate modeling, I think Steve can answer even more on the paleoclimate integration, but do you want to take a shot at that?
A lot of what we understand about what has caused past natural variations in climate, warm spells, cold spells, have been by studying the paleo record and documenting when we've gone through a major cold spell and then figuring out what triggered it. And as that understanding develops and is put into the GCMs, then the climate models can reflect natural variability such that then we can look at unnatural variability that we're in now.
Happy to talk more about that afterwards if you want as well. So one more here and then. Okay, I've got two more here, so why don't we go here and then over here.
This is sort of a follow-up to the first question you had about the island states coming with the green, the button, right? I'm sort of curious, and when you went through the list of companies, you mentioned Apple and Microsoft, and so it doesn't really stir a lot of emotion there because you don't really think of them pushing the button. What about OPEC, right? I mean, they have, so petroleum exporting countries who have a stake at keeping the status quo in the energy market. What about putting that into one of your motivations for having an international conversation about this?
So when I give much longer talks about the politics of geoengineering in particular, so not all of broad climate change, but particularly these technologies, that figures very prominently. And it's not just oil companies, but oil-producing states, and also developing states, rapidly developing emerging economies, or states that are already, like the United States, very reliant on and have certain entrenched industries that, for better or worse, good or bad, provide a lot of jobs and provide a lot of energy, but at the same time produce a lot of CO2. And there's a lot of those interest groups that are involved in these sorts of politics that are hard to unpack and unwind, and the ways in which they represent or misrepresent scientific information ties back in some ways to the question about belief in science and how you represent and how you communicate it. The short answer is yes. They are. It is a major issue to think about going forward, and it's one of the reasons I think a global conversation, a transparent global conversation, is so important. So, sorry.
Yeah, early on in your lecture, probably 10 slides into it, showed the eruption of a volcano and an increasing level of aerosols, the sulfur in the climate, the corresponding climate cooling, when it comes back up, very compelling, substantiating the argument that increasing aerosols is going to decrease the temperature. However, at the end of that slide, about 1995, there's a decrease in temperature with no corresponding increase in aerosols. Kind of begs the question of what caused that decrease in temperature, and is the aerosol argument really valid?
So that's an excellent question. I showed a very narrow selection of data because it's the data that's almost always shown when you're talking about demonstrating the impact of volcanoes. Now, one of the reasons we know aerosol particles cool it off is if you look back not only through that 1995 or the 1991 to 1995, but you look at Mount Krakatoa or you look at Mount St. Helens. There's several other large eruptions that go back throughout the last century and even many far before that, going back into the paleoclimate now. There's starting to, or not really paleoclimate, but early last millennium. There's evidence that a series of volcanic eruptions might have triggered the Little Ice Age. There's some new papers on that. It's not just one example. I use one example because it's the most recent and people know it, but there's lots of examples that substantiate and show that injection of aerosols cool it down. Now, things like the dip at the end, things like, if I go into the technical details of this, this has been normalized to take out some other trends. Now, what does that mean in technical or in scientific terms? It basically means we took out other factors that we know how to model, and we know we're driving some of those other trends, like the dip in the end, like the overarching El Niña cycles that we see for temperature patterns in different places, and you get as a result the very clear cooling effect of things like Mount Pinatubo. But it goes to show that it's not one thing we're doing to the climate system. I've talked about a few examples, but I can't do justice in a very short talk to all of the different things on that IPCC forcing slide that human beings put into the atmosphere that's shaping our climate, that's shaping the future of our climate system. And unpacking each and every one of them is a long, difficult process, and how that information ends up flowing and how these sorts of questions get addressed when you talk with policymakers and when you set decision-making structures up that have very limited times and political pressures and have to go through and process all of that information and boil it down to key messages. How does that end up happening? So, long story short, we do have, I can show you, if you'd like, I can show you a whole other slide presentation just on aerosols and just on the impact, but we'll do that offline.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much.